You know that moment when you're chasing pleasure and suddenly catch yourself mid-pursuit and something inside you goes cold? Not because the pleasure isn't real, not because you don't want it, but because in that split second, you see yourself from outside and you realize you're not enjoying the chase anymore. You're just ... moving, like a machine that forgot why it was built. The party doesn't hit the same, the dopamine spike from your phone feels hollow. The sex is mechanical. The food tastes like cardboard wrapped in nostalgia, and yet you keep reaching, keep scrolling, keep consuming, because stopping would mean facing something you're not ready to name. You probably think something's broken in you, that you've burned out your pleasure circuits, that you've become numb, jaded, cynical. Maybe you Google anhedonia at 2 a.m. Maybe you wonder if this is depression, or if you've simply ruined yourself with too much of everything. You ask yourself the question that keeps you up at night, will I ever feel anything real again? But what if I told you that this isn't numbness at all? What if this moment of seeing through pleasure, this sensation of being a ghost in your own pursuit of joy, is actually your consciousness evolving past the most sophisticated trap the human mind ever built? What if the emptiness you're feeling isn't the death of your capacity for pleasure, but the birth of something that doesn't need pleasure to feel whole? Because here's what nobody tells you about pleasure. It was never supposed to satisfy you. Pleasure is a biological bribe, an evolutionary carrot designed to make you do things that keep you alive and reproducing, eat, fuck, rest, compete, win. Every hit of dopamine is your nervous system saying, good job, keep doing that. But somewhere along the way, we confused the signal for the destination. We started chasing the bribe itself, thinking that if we could just accumulate enough pleasure, stack enough good feelings, engineer enough peak experiences, we'd finally arrive at something called happiness. Schopenhauer saw this con game clearly in the 19th century. He called it the pendulum of existence. We swing between pain and boredom, and in between, for just a moment, we experience satisfaction. But satisfaction isn't a state, it's a transition. The moment you notice pleasure, it's already becoming memory. You're already comparing it to the last time, calculating whether it was better or worse, wondering if you can make it happen again. The consciousness that experiences pleasure is the same consciousness that immediately converts it into past tense. You can never actually be inside pleasure. You can only remember that you were, which means you're always arriving just after pleasure has left the room. This is what happened to you. You didn't break your pleasure response. You woke up inside the mechanism. You saw, for just a moment, that pleasure isn't a thing you experience. It's a story you tell yourself about something that already happened. And once you see that, once you catch yourself in the act of converting present moment sensation into narrative, you can't unsee it. The magic trick stops working. Not because the trick changed, but because you're no longer looking at the rabbit. You're looking at the hat, and the hand, and the misdirection, and suddenly the whole performance feels ... sad. Desperate, even. Let me give you an analogy, and stay with me because this is going to feel uncomfortable before it feels true. Imagine you've been watching a movie your entire life, not on a screen, inside your head. It's a gorgeous movie, full of beautiful scenes, emotional crescendos, perfectly timed moments of joy and relief and triumph. You are completely absorbed in this movie. You laugh at the funny parts, you cry at the sad parts. You feel terror during the chase scenes and euphoria during the victories. The movie is about a character trying to find happiness by collecting experiences. Pleasure is the currency of this movie. Every scene is about pursuit, acquisition, consumption, and the brief golden moment when the character gets what they wanted. For most of your life, you are this character. There's no separation between you and the movie. When the character wins, you win. When the character suffers, you suffer. When the character experiences pleasure, that pleasure is yours, completely and totally. This is normal. This is how human consciousness typically operates. We are so identified with the narrative of pursuit and acquisition that we don't realize we're watching a movie at all. We think we're living in objective reality, but then something shifts. Maybe it happens slowly, over years of diminishing returns. Maybe it happens suddenly, in a moment of crisis or insight. But one day, you become aware of the screen. Not fully aware, just ... aware enough. You're still watching the movie, still following the story, But now, there's this tiny gap, this microscopic distance between you and the character. You notice you're watching. For a split second, you see that the pleasure the character experiences isn't happening to you, it's happening to them, on screen, in story. And you are here, in the dark, observing. This is deeply disorienting, because the movie doesn't stop. The character keeps chasing pleasure. Your body keeps generating dopamine. Your mind keeps constructing narratives about what you need to be happy. But now there's this witness, this awareness, that won't go back into the movie completely. Part of you is still watching, still seeing the gap between sensation and the story about sensation. And from that position, pleasure looks different, not less intense, not less real in a biochemical sense, but less true, less convincing as a solution to anything. The character on screen is still saying, I need this thing to be happy. But you, sitting in the dark, can see that the character said that about the last thing to take, and the thing before that, and the thing before that. You can see the pattern that the character can't see, the pursuit that never ends, the satisfaction that never lasts, the pleasure that promises completion but only delivers craving for more pleasure. Once your eyes adjust to the darkness of the theater, once you realize you're not actually the character on screen, you can't go back to full absorption. You can't unsee the screen. You can't forget that you're watching. And this feels like a catastrophic loss. Because if you're not the character, if pleasure is just something happening in the movie and not to you directly, then what the hell are you? And what's the point of any of this? This is what's happening when you feel empty in the middle of pleasure, when you see yourself reaching for dopamine and realize you're going through the motions. When everything that used to work stops working. You haven't lost your ability to feel. You've gained the ability to see that feeling isn't what you thought it was. You're no longer completely identified with the pursuing self, the self that needs pleasure to feel alive. And that self, that character, is panicking. Because its whole existence depends on you believing the movie is real. And if you've been nodding along, if this is resonating somewhere deeper than your thoughts, maybe it's time to join the space where we go deeper every week. This isn't surface-level content. You already know that. You know where the button is. So naturally, the first thing you try to do is fix the problem. You try to get back into the movie. You pursue bigger pleasures, stronger stimulation. You think maybe you just need to level up the intensity. Maybe you've built tolerance like a drug addict, and you just need a bigger hit to feel something again. So you chase harder experiences, riskier behavior, more extreme content, stranger sexual encounters, louder music, brighter lights. You're trying to force your way back into absorption, back into the state where pleasure was convincing, where the movie felt real. But here's the devastating thing. The more you chase intensity, the more you reinforce the gap. Because intense pleasure requires intense pursuit, which requires intense awareness of the distance between where you are and where you want to be. You're trying to lose yourself by becoming more conscious of the thing you want to lose yourself in. You're trying to forget you're watching by staring harder at the screen. It doesn't work. It can't work. The mechanism is eating itself. This is when pleasure becomes something darker. Not just unsatisfying, but almost hostile. You start using pleasure as violence against yourself. You pursue things that hurt, that degrade, that punish, because at least pain is convincing. At least suffering feels real in a way pleasure no longer does. You might not consciously recognize this pattern, but somewhere in your behavior, there's a signature of self-destruction, a repeated move toward things that promise pleasure but deliver damage. And you keep making that move because damage at least penetrates the numbness. Suffering proves you exist in a way pleasure can't anymore. You're caught in a loop. Epicurus warned about 2,000 years ago. The pleasure seeker who mistakes intensity for satisfaction will always become a slave to intensity. He'll need more and more to feel less and less, until he's not even seeking pleasure anymore. He's seeking relief from the craving for pleasure. He's trying to satisfy an appetite that grows larger with every feeding. And the terrible thing, he can't stop feeding it, because stopping would mean experiencing the craving directly, without the temporary sedation of pleasure. And that craving, that raw wanting without satisfaction, feels unbearable. So what do you do when pleasure doesn't work and more pleasure makes it worse, and you can see yourself trapped in the mechanism but can't seem to stop the machine? You do something that sounds absolutely insane from inside the pleasure paradigm. You stop trying to go back into the movie. You stop trying to fix your broken pleasure response. You stop treating this gap between yourself and experience as a problem to be solved. Instead, you turn around and look at what's watching. You investigate the consciousness that sees through pleasure. You ask, if I'm not the character chasing satisfaction, what am I? And here's where language starts to fail. Because what you discover isn't a thing. It's not a new kind of pleasure. It's not even a state of consciousness you can point to and say, there, that's it. It's more like the absence of the illusion that you needed pleasure to be complete. Philosophers and mystics have called this by different names. Heidegger called it being toward death, the authentic existence that faces its own finitude without distraction. Buddhists call it dukkha cessation, the end of craving. Existentialists call it radical freedom, the recognition that you're not determined by your appetites. I'm going to call it conscious sufficiency. And it's not what you think. Conscious sufficiency isn't contentment. It's not peaceful. It doesn't feel good in the way pleasure feels good. It's more like recognizing that the sense of incompleteness that drives all pleasure seeking isn't actually true. It's a story. A very convincing story, written into your nervous system by evolution. Reinforced by culture, confirmed by every advertisement and every narrative you've ever consumed. The story says, you are incomplete, you lack something. Pleasure will fill the lack. And conscious sufficiency is what happens when you see that story as a story and realize you were never actually incomplete. You were just convinced you were. This doesn't mean you stop experiencing pleasure. Your nervous system still works. Dopamine still happens. Joy still arises. But the pleasure isn't doing anything anymore. It's not completing you. It's not solving the problem of existence. It's just ... sensation, arising and passing. And you, the consciousness that witnesses it, are not defined by whether it's present or absent. You are sufficient whether you're experiencing pleasure or pain or absolute neutrality. The sufficiency was always there. You just couldn't see it because you were too busy chasing the thing you thought you needed to become sufficient. Now, I must warn you about something. When I say sufficient, you're probably imagining some kind of enlightened serenity, some peaceful state where you're happy all the time without needing anything. And that sounds either impossible or boring as hell. You might be thinking, great, so the solution to pleasure not working is to become emotionally dead? To stop wanting anything? To exist in some gray flatness where nothing matters? And I understand that objection. It sounds like I'm describing depression with a philosophical facelift. Who wants to be sufficient if sufficiency means numbness? Who wants to stop chasing pleasure if the alternative is just ... existing without pursuing anything? But here's what you're missing. The flatness, the grayness, the emotional death you're imagining, that's where you are right now. That's what chasing pleasure feels like when you can see through it. The movie that doesn't work anymore. The dopamine hits that feel hollow. The desperate pursuit of intensity that only produces exhaustion. You're already in the gray flatness. You're just blaming it on not having enough pleasure when it's actually caused by believing you need pleasure to feel alive. Conscious sufficiency isn't less than pleasure. It's what pleasure was always pointing toward but could never deliver. It's the sense of being complete without needing anything external to complete you. And yes, that sounds mystical and abstract and useless. Until you've actually experienced what it's like to exist for 5 minutes without the background hum of craving, without the subtle sense that something's wrong, something's missing, something needs to be fixed or acquired or consumed before you can relax. Most people have never experienced 5 consecutive minutes without that hum. It's so constant we don't even notice it. It's like the sound of your own breathing. You only hear it when someone points it out, but when it stops, when the craving drops away, even temporarily, when you exist without the story that you're incomplete, the world doesn't become less vivid, it becomes more vivid. Because you're not filtering everything through the question, will this satisfy me? You're just ... here, present, aware, sufficient. Let me tell you about someone I knew. We'll call him Marcus. Marcus was a sensation connoisseur. He collected peak experiences the way some people collect art. He'd traveled to 60 countries by 30, done ayahuasca in the Amazon, climbed Kilimanjaro, had a rotation of beautiful partners who thought he was endlessly fascinating. He threw legendary parties. He knew every chef, every artist, every interesting person in his city. He was living the life we're all supposed to want. The life where pleasure is abundant and accessible and constantly renewed, and he was absolutely miserable. Not in an obvious way. He didn't complain. He kept pursuing, kept collecting, kept engineering the next peak experience. But if you watched carefully, you could see it, the diminishing returns. The slightly longer recovery time needed before the next pursuit, the way his eyes would glaze over during even the most intense experiences. Like, part of him was somewhere else, calculating whether this was as good as the last time, whether he was squeezing enough juice from this particular moment. The breaking point came during a perfect sunset in Santorini. He was with someone he loved, drinking expensive wine, watching the sky turn colors that looked photoshopped. Objectively, aesthetically, hedonically, this was a peak moment, and he felt nothing. Not numbness exactly, more like he was watching himself have the experience. He could see that it was beautiful, he could recognize that he should be feeling something profound. But there was this gap, this distance, this sense of watching himself from outside. And in that gap, he realized something that terrified him. He'd been chasing experiences his entire adult life, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd actually been inside one. He didn't have a spiritual awakening in that moment. He didn't suddenly become enlightened. He just stopped. For the first time in maybe a decade, he stopped planning the next thing. Stopped mentally cataloging the experience to share on social media. Stopped comparing this sunset to previous sunsets. He just sat there, in the gap, feeling the terror of not pursuing anything. And in that terror, something shifted. Not because he tried to make it shift, but because when you stop running even for a moment, you discover you weren't being chased. The sense of incompleteness that drove all the chasing, all the collecting, all the peak experience engineering, it was always optional, a story he was telling himself. A story that felt absolutely true right up until the moment he stopped believing it. Marcus didn't become a monk. He didn't give up pleasure or travel or beauty or connection. But his relationship with those things transformed. He stopped needing them to feel complete. Which meant when they arose, he could actually be with them, instead of already mentally reaching for the next thing. The sunset was just a sunset, not a solution, not a deficiency corrected, just phenomenon, arising and passing, witnessed by a consciousness that didn't need the sunset to be okay. This is you right now. You're in Santorini, watching the sunset, feeling nothing. Terrified that you've broken something in yourself, but you haven't broken anything. You've just stopped believing, even partially, that the sunset was ever going to save you. That any experience, no matter how intense or beautiful or pleasurable, was going to fill the sense of incompleteness. And now you're in the gap, seeing the mechanism, watching yourself pursue things while simultaneously knowing the pursuit is empty. This is not a mistake. This is not damage. This is the exact process by which consciousness evolves beyond the pleasure trap. It feels like dying because something is dying. The self that needed pleasure to feel whole. The identity built on pursuit and acquisition and consumption. The character in the movie who was convinced the next scene would finally deliver satisfaction. That self has to die. Not because it's evil or wrong, but because it was never actually you. It was a strategy, a survival mechanism. A way of organizing experience around the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. And it worked. For a while, it got you here. But now, it's suffocating you. Now you can see that the strategy creates the very incompleteness it promises to solve. And you can't go back to not seeing that. The only way out is through. And if you're still here, if you're tracking this, if some part of you is recognizing itself in these words, consider staying. We explore these depths every single week. This is not entertainment. This is not content. This is an investigation into what you actually are underneath the story of lack. So what do you actually do? How do you move through this gap between seeing through pleasure and discovering conscious sufficiency? First, understand what you absolutely cannot do. You cannot force this. You cannot make yourself become sufficient through effort. That's still the pleasure paradigm. Still the idea that if you just do the right thing, acquire the right state, you'll finally arrive at completion. Sufficiency isn't something you achieve. It's what's left when you stop trying to achieve anything. But there are things you can do that create space for recognition. Think of them as anti-practices, not methods to get somewhere, but ways to stop running. Start here. The next time you notice yourself reaching for pleasure, whether it's food, sex, entertainment, substances, whatever, pause for exactly 5 seconds before you reach. Not to stop yourself, not to judge the impulse, just to observe it. Feel the craving in your body. Notice where it lives. Notice how it feels like an emergency. Like if you don't satisfy it right now, something terrible will happen. Notice how the craving itself contains the story of incompleteness. I need this thing to feel okay. And then, whether you indulge the craving or not, watch what happens after. If you indulge it, watch how the satisfaction dissolves almost immediately into either the next craving or the vague sense that it wasn't quite as good as you hoped. If you don't indulge it, watch how the craving intensifies, peaks, and then subsides on its own. Watch how it threatens you with psychological death if you don't feed it. And then, when you don't, nothing actually dies. The craving just transforms into something else. You're not trying to eliminate craving, you're studying it. Getting curious about the mechanism. The pleasure paradigm says, craving is the problem, satisfaction is the solution. But what if craving is just a sensation, and the problem is believing the story that craving tells you about your incompleteness? Second, start noticing the gap. That space between experience and your story about experience. It's there all the time. You're just not usually conscious of it. The gap between seeing a beautiful thing and thinking that's beautiful. The gap between feeling sensation in your body and naming it pleasure or pain. The gap between something happening and you deciding what it means. In that gap, before the story, is bare consciousness. Awareness without narrative. And that awareness, it doesn't need anything. It's not incomplete. It's not pursuing anything. It's just here, witnessing, sufficient in itself. You can't live in the gap. You're a human with a narrative-constructing mind. Stories will arise. But noticing the gap, even for a moment, reveals something crucial. You are not the story. You are what the story arises in. And what the story arises in doesn't need the story to be happy. It doesn't need anything. It's sufficient by nature. Third, stop seeking intensity. This is going to feel wrong. Your entire conditioning says that if pleasure isn't working, you need stronger pleasure, better experiences, more extreme sensations. But intensity is just the pleasure paradigm on steroids. It's the craving saying, maybe if we just amp this up enough, it'll finally work. But it won't. The emptiness you feel isn't caused by insufficient intensity. It's caused by believing that intensity will fill something that was never actually empty. So do the opposite. Seek boring, seek ordinary, seek the moments that don't promise anything. Washing dishes, walking without destination, sitting without consuming content. These moments feel intolerable at first. Your mind will scream at you that you're wasting time, that you should be pursuing something. Let it scream. You're not trying to enjoy the boredom. You're discovering what's here when you're not chasing something else. Fourth, and this is crucial, stop comparing, stop asking whether this experience is better or worse than previous experiences. Stop rating your pleasure. Stop trying to optimize your joy. Comparison is how the pleasure paradigm maintains its power. It convinces you that satisfaction is always somewhere else, in some other moment. And if you could just engineer the right conditions, you'd finally get there. But every moment you're comparing, you're not actually here. You're in a mental simulation, judging the present against an imagined ideal. And the present always loses that comparison because the imagined ideal doesn't have the synthesis, the imperfection, the ordinariness of actual experience. When you stop comparing, when you stop ranking and rating and measuring, something strange happens. What's actually here becomes vivid. Not because it got more intense, but because you stopped filtering it through the question, is this good enough? Without that filter, a cup of coffee is just a cup of coffee. Not better than yesterday or worse than that cafe in Barcelona. Just this taste, this temperature, this moment. Nothing needs to be added or subtracted. It's sufficient because it's what's actually happening, and what's actually happening is always sufficient. It's your story about what should be happening that creates the sense of lack. And finally, the hardest instruction. Stop trying to feel better. Stop treating your emotional state as a problem to be solved. The whole pleasure game is based on the idea that negative feelings are emergencies that require immediate action. Feel bored. Consume something, feel empty, pursue pleasure, feel anxious, seek relief? But what if those feelings aren't emergencies? What if they're just weather patterns moving through consciousness? They arise, they peak, they dissolve. And you, the consciousness that witnesses them, are not damaged by their presence. This doesn't mean you become passive. It doesn't mean you stop taking care of yourself. It means you stop treating your inner experience as something that needs to be fixed before you're allowed to exist. You're allowed to exist exactly as you are, feeling exactly what you're feeling, complete and sufficient, even in the middle of discomfort. The paradox is this: pleasure becomes possible again when you stop needing it. When you recognize your inherent sufficiency, when you're no longer using experience to fill a lack, then pleasure can just be pleasure, not a solution, not a salvation, just sensation, arising in awareness. And it's enough. Not because it's more intense than before, but because you're no longer asking it to be anything other than what it is. This is what your nervous system is trying to show you by making pleasure feel empty. It's not broken. It's trying to mature beyond the pleasure trap. It's trying to evolve into conscious sufficiency. The emptiness isn't the problem, it's the answer. It's showing you that the thing you've been chasing was never going to complete you because you were never actually incomplete. Here's what actually happens as this process unfolds. You don't lose your capacity for pleasure. That's the fear, right? That becoming sufficient means becoming numb, flat, emotionally dead, but it's precisely the opposite. When you're no longer dependent on pleasure to feel whole, pleasure becomes more vivid because you're not clutching at it. You're not desperately trying to make it last, or intensify it, or compare it to previous pleasures. You're just with it, present to it. And presence allows pleasure to be fully experienced instead of immediately converted into story and grasped at and turned into ammunition for the next pursuit. You become more alive, not less. But it's a different kind of aliveness. Not the manic intensity of pleasure chasing, more like clarity, vividness. The world stops looking like a vending machine full of experiences you need to consume. It starts looking like what it actually is. Phenomenon arising in consciousness. And you, the consciousness it's arising in, are vast enough to contain all of it without needing any of it to be different. This is what was always underneath the pleasure-seeking. This sufficiency, this okayness that doesn't depend on conditions. Kierkegaard called it resting transparently in the power that established it. Camus called it imagining Sisyphus, happy, finding freedom in the middle of the absurd. It's the recognition that the meaning you were seeking through pleasure accumulation was never in the pleasure. It was in the consciousness capable of experiencing pleasure. And that consciousness doesn't need anything to be conscious. It's sufficient by nature. But this sounds too simple, doesn't it? Too plain, too undramatic. Your mind wants transformation to look like fireworks, like a peak experience, like finally acquiring the state of consciousness that solves everything. And conscious sufficiency doesn't look like that. It looks like nothing special. Like ordinary life. Like washing dishes and drinking coffee and talking to people, and experiencing pleasure and pain and boredom without any of it meaning you're incomplete. The mind that was trained to seek intensity will dismiss this as boring. As insufficient, it will say, is that all there is? And that question is the trap. Because the question itself assumes there should be something more, some peak state.